All right, everybody. Carmen and Ian here again with a new episode of Stasios. Hey, Ian.
Hey, Carmen. How you doing?
Good. So today we are going to talk about a essay that Ian wrote for Stasios in 2019. I was just checking. So it's been a little while, but this is one of our most popular posts on Stasios, and it's called On Matthew and Luke's Contradictory Genealogies. And Ian, you wrote this as sort of like a comprehensive resource on this very big contradiction in the Bible, which we can sum up, and obviously you're going to go into it here in our conversation, but basically Matthew and Luke both have genealogies of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and they are way different. They have less, or you get to describe to the audience what is going on with these contradictory genealogies.
Yes, exactly as you said. They are both genealogies of Joseph, but they are completely different and completely contradictory genealogies. So both have a different father for Joseph, both have a different paternal grandfather for Joseph. So not just, you can't say one is his paternal grandfather and one is his maternal grandfather. They're both clearly his paternal grandfather, but they're both different people. And then those people have two different fathers and so on. And the entire genealogies contradict.
Okay, and so there's not even a little bit. There's not even like, okay, they intersect here.
Yeah, so if you go far enough back in the middle of the genealogies, they both have this famous guy, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, who's a famous Old Testament figure. And this is interesting, actually, because it was probably well known amongst people who knew Jesus that he was a descendant of Zerubbabel. Anyone in Judah would have known who Zerubbabel was. Anyone in Judea, he was kind of a founder of post-exilic Judea. And people knew Zerubbabel was a descendant of David. In fact, they knew Zerubbabel's father. Everyone kind of knew that. They knew Zerubbabel was the son of this guy, Shealtiel. He was called Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel. And they knew he was a descendant of David. And they knew Jesus was a descendant of this Zerubbabel guy. So both of them have Zerubbabel kind of stuck into the middle. But an interesting thing about that is the genealogy of Zerubbabel that's in our manuscripts of Luke is not even right. So after you get past Zerubbabel, it's not even the correct genealogy of Zerubbabel. And we know Zerubbabel's genealogy. There's like an entire genealogy of him in the books of Chronicles, and Luke's completely contradicts it also. So they do overlap a little bit, but if anything, that just like exacerbates the problem even more.
Okay, so it's a big glaring obvious contradiction. So what kind of, like, obviously you saw it, noticed it, and went off searching for answers, but prior to you doing that, what's kind of been the way that biblical scholars have reconciled such a big contradiction?
Well, biblical scholars actually have had a pretty good answer to it for a while in the like published scholarly literature. And ultimately, the explanation that I sort of lay out in this piece is from a biblical scholar named H.A. Blair, who I think wrote this piece in the 90s. And his explanation is very comprehensive and detailed. It's in a very simple way, explains kind of all the key facts. But when I wrote this piece, and I wrote it largely kind of to help me unravel the problem as I was explaining it, I realized there were really no good resources at all in like the first several pages of Google results in 2019. And what's weird about this is lots of anti-Christians like Richard Dawkins were using this contradiction. So it's not like atheists weren't noticing the problem. Atheists were noticing and attacking the Bible using this contradiction. But then if you looked in the first couple pages of Google, a lot of the answers from Christians, not scholarly answers, but answers on like websites and blogs and stuff, were just really stupid. Like wouldn't have satisfied a sincere seeker at all. Like I remember one common answer that popped up a lot in the first page of results is people would say, oh, one is the royal line. That's the explanation. And it's like, okay, think of another royal person. Think of like Prince William. What if I told you like, all right, did you know Prince William has actually got two different genealogies? He's the son of Charles, the son of Philip, and he's also the son of Alfred, son of Arthur, right? And you were like, Ian, what are you talking about? I mean, are you saying his mother was unfaithful, so he's got like a different legal father, I don't know what you're saying. And I imagine my explanation then was, oh, one is the royal line. Like no one, even just a below average intelligence person would know that doesn't make any sense. Like that's not an answer to the question.
Mm-hmm.
But for whatever reason, I guess some Christians thought that was some sort of answer. It's like they were just shutting off their brains.
Yeah.
So there was no good, like accessible resource, not on YouTube, not in the first few pages of Google. And so I wanted to create that. And that's why I wrote this. And
Gotcha.
to this day, every now and then we'll still get an email about it.
Yeah. Does Michael Jones have anything about it?
Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy, unfortunately had and I'd love to interact with him about this. Unfortunately, he had a YouTube video supporting the Africanus Eusebius.
Oh, gotcha.
I don't know how much you want to get into that, but I
want to debate. That would be good. You guys would be great. That would be fun to see because, he's obviously a very smart guy, but also very reasonable. And I would think he would be open to what you would have to say. So that would be good.
I would be very interested in hearing, what he would think about the H.A. Blair theory I lay out in the piece.
Yeah. Why don't you just spell it out for us? What's kind of the, like you just said, Michael Jones has the Africanus, how you say it? Africanus view, which is probably the most popular one, right?
I don't think so. I think if you want to get a little deeper than the like vague non-answers, like if you want to get a little deeper than the people that just say one is the royal line or something like that, if you go around, if you're a Christian and you start going around your church and you say to people, oh, I noticed these genealogies totally contradict, what's the explanation? Probably what someone will say to you is they'll give you the mistranslation theory. They'll say, oh, our English translations of Luke are mistranslations. And actually, the correct translation is that Jesus was thought to be the son of Joseph, but he was actually the son of Heli. And then they'll say son means grandson. So Heli is actually the father of Mary. And so if our English translations were correct, they would show that Luke is a Marian genealogy. And the biggest problem with that is that there is literally no major English translation that takes that interpretation. Open up any English translation, it will not say that, Jesus was not actually the son of Joseph. He was the son of this Heli guy, and therefore you can kind of infer Heli was Mary's father. So you're basically the people that take that interpretation, which is remarkably common, are saying that every major English translation is wrong about that verse in Luke.
Gotcha. So that's unlikely. So we've got mistranslation. We've got Africanus.
Yeah, Africanus Eusebius. So Africanus was an early Christian writer. And then this theory is somewhat well known because Eusebius, who is the father of church history, picked it up and adopted it. And the idea there is there was what's called a levirate marriage, which is an Old Testament Deuteronomic practice. And levirate marriage existed. It was a real thing. It's in the Old Testament. So Africanus didn't make it up. Eusebius didn't make it up. But what that is if a man with a brother is engaged to be married and dies, his brother will then marry his fiancée, and their first son will be considered the legal son of the deceased brother. And intuitively, you can kind of see a little bit why that's appealing, because, it gives you a different biological father and a different legal father. And so if you don't think about it and you kind of squint, you can sort of pretend it solves the problem. But then what you realize is that, so just think if anyone has a paternal uncle, right? Your dad has some brother. Imagine that your paternal uncle had adopted you, and so he became your legal father, right? That's basically what this is. You've got a separate biological father and a separate legal father who's your paternal uncle. would that change? Just think about this. Would that change who your paternal grandfather was? No, your paternal grandfather would still be the same person.
Right.
But on this theory, you've got to account for the fact that Joseph has two different also paternal grandfathers, and so on, forever. And so then Africanus also adds in that the two brothers were half brothers by the same mother. And so it's just this really cockamamie twister game that has no support in the text, makes no sense, and it's basically just kind of helping yourself to the most implausible and ridiculous explanation that could conceivably explain away the contradiction in this very like wooden way.
Okay. Yeah, because I remember in your essay you have a picture of the guy, like the mystery solving meme, because that's what it sounds like, you know, where he's like conspiracy theory type moving things around. Okay.
It's very Alex Jones explanation.
Feels very Da Vinci Code-ish.
And so this is, Carmen mentioned a moment ago, Michael Jones, who's a prominent Christian philosopher, apologist. He has a video on this topic where to the best of my recollection, he endorses, or at minimum, he seriously entertains the Africanus Eusebius theory, which I always just found to be crazy.
Yeah, well, we like his work a lot, so hopefully he'll look at this and consider, you know.
He has many good things on many other topics. For sure.
Yeah, I love his videos. They're highlight of my day. His little like weary face when he sees some nonsense and responds. But I would love for him to engage with this a little bit more, because it seems like it would be of interest to him. So if we're taking mistranslation and we're taking Africanus, what are we left with? What's the better explanation for why these genealogies are so massively different?
Well, so the most obvious, I think, couple of data points here that point us to an explanation are, one, you have multiple ancient witnesses who describe the genealogy in Matthew as a biological genealogy of Mary. So you have Clement of Alexandria, who's a 2nd century church father, controversial church father. Victorinus is a prominent Christian writer in eschatology in the 3rd century, describes very clearly the genealogy in Matthew as a genealogy of Mary from whom Christ took flesh. And you've also got evidence that other early Christians understood Jesus' Davidic descent to be from Mary. So Justin Martyr refers to Mary, who was a virgin of the house of David. So people thought that Jesus was a descendant of David by way of Mary, and people also tell us that when they were looking at Matthew, they were looking at a biological genealogy of Mary. Now that is not at all what our manuscripts of Matthew show. Our manuscripts of Matthew just show another genealogy of Joseph. But this gives us pretty good reason to think that early manuscripts of Matthew had a biological genealogy of Mary. And I go through in the piece a few different reasons to think that this is the case.
Gotcha.
Including that no one in the first couple of centuries of the church said anything about there being contradictory genealogies. No one said, hey, these genealogies seem to contradict. Here's my explanation, right? Even the people who tell us about how Matthew wrote a biological genealogy of Mary, none of those people were trying to explain a contradiction. They don't say, hey, the Docetics or the Gnostics or the Marcionites or the Jews, these people are out there saying the genealogies contradict, but don't worry, I have an answer. I'm here to tell you that it's fine because Matthew is giving us a genealogy of Mary. They mention that the Matthew genealogy is Marian and biological while they're talking about other topics, right? So no one's even noticing this contradiction. And that gives us really good reason to think there originally was not a contradiction, especially when you look at the 2nd century and you have people like Tertullian and like Justin Martyr and Clement of Alexandria. You have these lawyers and philosophers and scholars, Athenagoras, that are becoming Christians, and they're really diving into the biblical texts. And if none of these people noticed that there was a contradiction, one explanation for that could be that if we take these witnesses at face value who say Matthew gives us a biological genealogy of Mary, there was no contradiction because they were looking at a biological genealogy of Mary here in Matthew and a genealogy of Joseph in Luke. And so it wouldn't have occurred to them that there would be contradiction.
Yeah, that is pretty, because it's not like they wouldn't have been pressed to address that at the time if there had been one. Like, it would have been very shoved in their face, as they're converting and kind of coming up against other beliefs. And so the fact that there's nothing about it does suggest like it probably wasn't there, like you said. So
there was a lot of debate about the canon, even within the kind of Christian community. You had, Docetics, you had Marcionites debating about, theology, debating about what book should be in the Bible. Marcion said that in his canon, he used only the Gospel of Luke. So he would have had an incentive to be like, hey, Matthew is wrong, maybe is something he could have said. Luke is clearly the correct gospel, and there's this contradiction here. So this is something that almost certainly would have emerged as an issue. And frankly, even if it hadn't emerged from debate, you have all these inquisitive, bright Christian thinkers engaging with all kinds of challenging topics, and it's not plausible that they just wouldn't have noticed a contradiction.
Right. Okay. So what do we think happened to get the contradiction that we have, that we see in our translation?
Yeah, well, I should say what I'm going to suggest is there was interpolation, probably at some point in the 3rd century, or between maybe the late 2nd, early 3rd century, and then the interpolated version, so a modification in scribal transmission, became the common version. And so we don't have access to the original manuscripts where Matthew was just a straightforward biological genealogy of Mary, like Clement and like Victorinus and probably Justin Martyr were looking at. But even though that's theoretical interpolation, one thing I want to point out is it's beyond dispute that there was interpolation in the genealogies, because we have right now, it's not like we have one version of the manuscripts when it comes to we have one version of the text when it comes to Matthew's genealogy or Luke's genealogy. We do have many different genealogies in Matthew and Luke. And it's just that we, in making these English translations, have gone with the most common and most credible genealogy that we have. But there are many other genealogies out there. There's a famous example in one of Bart Ehrman's books on New Testament textual transmission, where he points to a medieval manuscript where it looks like the monk copyist mixed up the names because he was sort of lazily copying them from a table. And God, it appears in one of the genealogies. And in this high medieval manuscript, it says that God was the son of Aram because he accidentally inserted God into the genealogy instead of having him at the bookend of the genealogy.
I see.
I bring this up just to say, if people want to respond to what I'm saying by saying, no, interpolation never could have happened, that position isn't available to you, because there obviously has been interpolation, and there's different versions of the genealogies floating around out there that contradict.
Okay. And so if you saying that stresses someone out to the ultimate degree, and they say, well, if that option isn't available to me, and I have to acknowledge that, there have been errors in people transcribing the Bible, how can I trust it? How can I know that it's not full of those? How can I know that I'm not, believing something purely because it was mistranslated? What would be sort of your response to someone who has that anxiety?
Yeah, a few things I would say about that, or one thing I would say is that debate about interpolation has happened all throughout Christian history. So Jerome, where we get the Vulgate from, important church father, also Augustine, both of these guys participated in basically critical biblical scholarship on, are parts of our manuscripts interpolated? Are they not? In Catholic Bibles, Daniel is longer, for example, than in Protestant Bibles. Catholic Bibles have this, for example, this story of Bel and the dragon in the book of Daniel that's not in the Protestant Bible. And Jerome wrote critically about Bel and the dragon. Jerome said, Bell and the Dragon, I can tell, was originally written in Greek. It was inserted into Daniel after the fact. It's an interpolation, and Jerome said it has no authority as scripture, for example. And then, so church fathers that we think of as very credible, Protestants also, credit Jerome and credit Augustine, were open to this idea interpolation had happened, and we should look and try to determine what's interpolation. And then, of course, during the Reformation, if you're a Protestant, the Reformers, obviously, because Bell and the Dragon was taken out by the Reformers, but not by the Catholics at Trent. The Reformers were in fact, the Reformers were probably a little bit too open to thinking that things were interpolation. Martin Luther controversially wanted to take out, he wanted to throw away Revelation. He wanted to throw away Esther. I'm not endorsing that, but if you think that Martin Luther wasn't like a heretic, if you're a Protestant, I think that at minimum shows you need to be open to the idea that interpolation could have happened. Now, to go a level below that, what I would say is we have many manuscript traditions, many different lines of manuscript transmission, and we even have a lot of actual physical manuscript fragments from the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Like P52 is a famous one, which is from maybe even as early as 100 AD, is a fragment of the Gospel of John, where Jesus is saying, anyone who seeks the truth listens to my voice, to Pilate. That is maybe even a literal copy of the actual autograph of John, the original writing that we have from John. And we have all these really old manuscript fragments from the second century, 3rd century. And then beyond that, we have so many different traditions of different texts all over the world. They allow us to know with a really high degree of confidence what the original texts said. So I think we need to be open to the idea of interpolation. It's clearly happened. We can see lots of cases of it. That's not even really in dispute. And people like Jerome, Augustine, the Reformers, the fact of interpolation didn't stop them from being Christians. And the one other thing I'll say about this is even if you set aside all that stuff, if you just think about this from first principles, you can see there's no kind of magic law ordained by God that stops interpolation from happening. And one example every Protestant knows about probably is Mormonism. Mormonism, not only does it include a New Testament added on to the Old and New Testaments, but Joseph Smith wrote his own version of the existing biblical canon called the Joseph Smith translation, where he changed a lot of stuff in there, right? And he printed millions of copies of this. And I think every Protestant, every Catholic, every Eastern Orthodox person kind of understands nothing magically stopped that from happening. Like Joseph Smith wasn't struck dead by lightning when he did this. So there is no magical law that prevents this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good thing to point out, that, the way that God has told us his story has been through human means. Like he has had people write it down. And while that has led to interpolation, like you said, that also, though, does give you, if you really think about the amount of evidence that we have and how much of it overlaps, despite it being written by different people, that should give you confidence, right? We've talked about this before, because if it had just been like sort of, the narrative of a perfect book falls from the sky and that's it, like there's no way for you to check that against anything else, right? You just have to go off of the belief that like this is it, this is the perfect whole. Whereas the actual construction of the Bible, all these different collections of stories and genealogies and histories from different people in different times, all amazingly coinciding in very important ways, points to the fact that those central claims, at the very least, are almost certainly rock solid. Because what are the odds otherwise?
Yeah, that's right. The overlap is astonishing. It's astonishing how few errors there are when we look at all these different lines of manuscript transmission that we have. And I think one reason that Christians should believe God worked through human beings to reveal himself is that, where Christians are called to worship God with our minds. And the fact that we kind of need to sort through and solve some of these mysteries the way that Augustine did, or that Jerome did, or that the Reformers did, involves worshiping God with our minds, involves using the abilities that God has given us to think critically about these sorts of issues. We shouldn't expect that there's going to be no work and no thinking we have to do in order to, ascertain and apply what God has revealed to us.
Yeah. Super interesting, Ian. As always, we encourage our readers, listeners to go read the full essay on stasios.net.
We'll put it in the description.
Yeah, we'll drop it in the description. If you don't already like and follow Stasios on all the things, please do. YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and then definitely subscribe for our emails. That's the best way to stay up to date. Thanks, Ian.
Thanks, Carmen.